Phoenix Splash TV. When looking for really good music composition, sometimes you have to distance yourself from normal sources, that being musical bands and solo artists. Sometimes the greatest compositions can be found in a soundtrack, whether it be for a movie or a video game or even a television show. Today we'll be looking at one of the most underrated soundtracks of all time, Shinobi III: Return of the Ninja Master, a video game that was created by Sega and released for the 16-bit system known as the Mega Drive or Genesis. Now, believe it or not, the 16-bit era of video games was very similar to the Romantic era of music. The composition was on fire. If you look at the top 10 video game soundtracks of all time, you'll see a bunch of retro game soundtracks from this era of gaming. The 16-bit era created some of video games' most legendary composers, Yoko Shimomura, Koji Kondo, Nobuo Uematsu, and of course, Yuzo Koshiro. Each composer had a company that they were pretty much loyal to. Koji Kondo had Nintendo, Uematsu was with Squaresoft, and Yuzo Koshiro was pretty much the composer of Sega. Yuzo Koshiro is widely accepted as one of the greatest 16-bit composers of all time, and was a big name. Unlike other composers, Yuzo's name was usually on the title screen of the games that he worked on, even in the re-releases. Before Shinobi 3, there was the Revenge of the Shinobi. Revenge of the Shinobi introduced us to a ninja named Joe Musashi, and Yuzo Koshiro provided the soundtrack for Joe's dangerous adventures. It was a solid music score. And then Shinobi 3 came around, and Yuzo Koshiro wasn't listed as its composer. This led many fans to eventually conclude that the Revenge of the Shinobi's original soundtrack is far more superior than Shinobi 3's. Even today, some people still believe this.
Picking a scale. Great music, not as good as Revenge of Shinobi. Yuzo did not come back to make the music, sadly. The music compositions are pretty good. There's some cool levels in this game as well.
But to say that the Revenge of the Shinobi soundtrack is better than Shinobi 3's baffles me, because compositionally Shinobi 3's soundtrack is not only better than the Revenge of the Shinobi's, but it's one of the best soundtracks ever written on the Genesis, and I personally hold it in high regard. But this begs the question, who wrote the original soundtrack? If it's not the old great genius Yuzo Koshiro, then who? Shinobi 3's original soundtrack was written by a trio of composers. First up is Hirofumi Murasaki. He's composed music for Daytona USA, Clockwork Knight, and has played bass for the soundtrack of Dragon Force for the Sega Saturn. And then we have Morihiko Akiyama, who was the main composer for Columns 3. And then, finally, Masayuki Nagao, who would go on to write for Sonic 2, Sonic 3, and Sonic & Knuckles. So why did Sega pick these three over Yuzo Koshiro? Well, the first reason is because Yuzo's name wasn't quite established at the time of Revenge of the Shinobi's release. He didn't start getting notoriety until the Streets of Rage series took off. For the second reason, we have to look into a company called Santos. They were a video game company that produced mahjong video games in 1991 and arcade games. Sega purchased the company and renamed it to Megasoft. Sega would task the company to develop Mega Drive or Genesis games, and one of those games was Shinobi 3. Murasaki, Akiyama, and Nagao were already composing music for the company before Sega purchased it, and after the purchase they kept their jobs. You see, the trio took a collaborative approach to music composition rather than the more popular individual approach. They were a team, and damn, they were a pretty good one. First, let's talk about how the music goes with the game. The direction of the game was to focus on speed rather than difficulty, like its previous game. As a result, you get a ton of upbeat music within the score. Many of the fans of this soundtrack cite the upbeat songs as their favorite. In round 2, listen to how the composers introduce the horse galloping to establish a tempo.
Thank
This was always one of my favorite songs as a kid, and still remains a favorite amongst fans. The horse bobbing its head to the tempo and the fast-pacedness to the level make it a really memorable experience. With its fast pace and awesome triplet melody, it's no wonder it got a remix for Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing Transformed. In the surfing stage, we have another fast-paced song, and this one is another fan favorite. Though this one is smoother, and it also has a very unique presentation. Pay attention to the drums or the percussion. In the beginning of the stage, it's just a harmony without melody, and you're just surfing along for a few seconds. And when the first wave of enemies arrive, the drums come in with them. And as more enemies come after them, the melody starts to enter into the song. Now let's talk about how this trio of composers utilize teamwork. Nagao is credited to writing the opening theme of Shinobi, but this song established so much throughout the entire score of the game. You can hear melodies in it repeated throughout the game and the end credits. There's another melody that repeats throughout the game as well. This melody repeats at different speeds and in different arrangements throughout the entire game, and actually acts as a second theme. It makes me believe that all three of these composers sat down and decided what these melodies were going to be, and then individually wrote pieces utilizing these melodies. Three different composers utilizing the same motifs. Another thing worth mentioning about this soundtrack is the technicality of the songs themselves. Though 16-bit composers had many limitations, the one limitation that they didn't encounter was the use of human beings. If you were to take this music from this soundtrack and apply it to real instruments, it would be very difficult to play. Though the fan favorite songs are pretty good, my favorite songs of the soundtrack are found in round 3, called Body Weapon. Of the whole OST, I believe that these two songs you hear at the end of the stage attempt to tell a story of a character. In this stage, you encounter a monster character that follows you around through this murky environment. Now, first of all, I like everything about this first song, the low notes of a marimba and the overall dirtiness and murkiness to it. But then there's a hint of sorrow and somber added to it. Overall, the song gives out a conflicted emotion. And then you get to the boss, and the song known as My Dear D begins to play, and you get that same hint of melancholy almost right away, and the monster's death cry seems unsettling as well. And when you look into the backstory of this character, which isn't even present in the game, you can really tell why they went for a more somber approach. The monster, whose name is Hydra, is a collection of failed bioweapons that formed into life. It isn't controlled by the main villains of the game, it's just free to act on its own. So the battle between Joe and Hydra is pretty much circumstantial. They both see each other as a threat. And keep in mind, this isn't a story-driven game. This game is very fast-paced and doesn't even really have lines of dialogue. I never even knew this backstory until I looked it up on the internet. But even before I looked it up, I always had a feeling that this boss character wasn't necessarily a villain. Even the image that they show after you beat him kind of leaves you wondering. It really is a beautiful story that is told through its music and sound. If you had any other just generic battle theme during that battle, you would not get the same story. And the last thing I'll talk about is the sound in general. These composers really knew how to utilize the Genesis to its full potential. When most people compare the sound of an SNES to the sound of a Genesis, they often conclude that the Super Nintendo is better at producing more classical music, while the Genesis is really good at making rock and gritty music. As a result, you get a lot of drum-heavy songs within the OST, and they blend with the traditional Japanese instrument samples. It's almost like the composers knew that the Genesis excelled at that rock and roll band style music, and it's almost like a band is playing the soundtrack. Come to think of it, it's kinda like the Wagaki band before there was even a Wagaki band. In conclusion, as far as the Shinobi series music goes, this game always contained my favorite songs by a long shot. The melodies are memorable, and you can tell that a lot of work was put into this soundtrack. But why is this OST so good? Well, this game would be the last time the Santos trio would compose music together. I believe that going into this game, they probably knew that they would be going their separate ways after it, and thus they gave us a remarkable soundtrack. This was probably them at their best, and it shows. Even if you don't play video games and are just looking for good music composition, go ahead and give this soundtrack a listen. And well, anyways, thank you for watching. If you liked this video, give it a like and share it with a buddy, because I don't really think this video is going to get much views. And if you're a fan of this soundtrack, what is your favorite song from it? Or your favorite song of any Shinobi game? Leave it in the comments below. And anyways guys, this is Josh the Music Man, signing off.